were in fact about, we could say, fake news in a sense. They were both published in the same city, Strasbourg, by two French historians. One of them was Marc Bloch, and he published a splendid book which actually convinced me that I wanted to become an historian. Le Roi Thaumaturge, The Royal Touch, which is about a tradition according to which French and English kings were able to heal people suffering from scrofula, an infection of neck glands. So people traveled long distances in order to be healed by the kings. And Bloch, in that great book, unveiled the lie, the plot, we could say, according to which those kings presented themselves as a kind of magicians. Actually, the motto placed by Bloch on the front page of his book was, "Ce roi est un grand magicien." This king is a great magician. A passage from a line from Montesquieu's Persian letters. Then the other book is by Georges Lefebvre, also a book published in Strasbourg. Both Bloch and Lefebvre were teaching in Strasbourg at that moment, 1926, 1934, I think. And Lefebvre wrote a book about La Grande Peur de 1789, the Great Fear of 1789. A rumor, a fake news, we could say, which spread in the French countryside immediately after the fall of the Bastille, according to which the aristocrats, the French aristocrats, had been paid bandits in order to kill peasants as a revenge for the Bastille event. Now, both Bloch and Febvre were able to work on those fake news, we could say, in order to show, in the case of Bloch, the deep roots of the monarchical power. Along the long Middle Ages, the last French king who healed the people suffering of scrofula was Charles IX in 1829. Charles X, sorry, 1829, just before the July Revolution. So a very sorry,
Yeah,
there's something wrong.
It's all right.
Yeah, okay. Then in the case of Lefebvre, the idea that, to capture the political atmosphere in France, in the French countryside, and the fear of the aristocrats, and peasants fearing a revenge in that turning point of French, of European, we could say, of world history. So, let's say, documents about a legend, about a lie, about a fake news, can be used in order to unveil, to capture something very deep. So, the problem is how to read those documents. And I think that there is no blueprint. In other words, we have to teach that technique through examples. And so we are back to cases, case studies. We could look at those great books as case studies. But is it possible to provide a kind of a general description of a technique? No, I don't think so.
I want to shift this a little bit to your books specifically. And before we get into that, I just had a slightly lighter question, which is your obsession, the delightful, wonderful obsession with titles.
With titles, that's true.
A book about Machiavelli called Nevertheless.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I provided the translation, but yeah, I mean, this was a word which, as I discovered, it's absolutely crucial for Machiavelli. In the crucial central chapter of The Prince, I mean, a book which has been read, commented, let's say, attacked for centuries, as far as I know, nobody realized that, I mean, the central chapters begin with a general sentence like, the prince must be truthful, non di manco, nevertheless. And then the most provocative arguments are provided. So there is a tension between the norm and the exception. The norm and the exception. So I put as a title, nevertheless, Machiavelli, comma, Pascal. And I started my introduction from the comma. I'm obsessed by punctuation, not only by titles, but by punctuation as well. And I think the ambiguity of commas is fascinating. So I started from that. And then, yeah, but I mean, The Cheese and the Worms, I love the title. And I remember that Fernand Braudel sent a letter, not to me, but to my publisher, Giulio Einaudi, who was also a close friend of my father and so on. My father co-founded the Einaudi publishing house in the 30s. But Braudel sent a letter saying, I read this book, Il formaggio ai vermi. The book is very good and I would like to publish it in my series, which he did, but the title is impossible. And I read this and I thought, well, I mean, you think about the French cheeses. I mean, in France, a cheese with worms would be impossible. Not in Italy, not in Sardinia, not in the Abruzzi, in any case. So for Menocchio, this was a metaphor, but he was looking at real cheese, rotten cheese, as a metaphor for the emergence of life from the world. And then, yeah, so like in a rotten cheese, worms emerged. They were the angels. So I had to choose this as a title. So yeah, I have a passion for titles. Actually, if I start a conversation with young and even less young scholars, that I have always about their own research, their ongoing research, I have a sort of impulse. And so I start to suggest titles for their research. About that I don't know anything, but I start to think about titles. Yeah.
Microscope, can I bring you back to the microscope? Your work reflects the sensitivity of microhistory, true microhistory. You've talked a little about this. The attention to smaller details, akin to viewing through a microscope, Cheese and the Worms, Cosmos of a 16th century Miller, read widely, especially in India. Tell us about the writing of this book. What were the basic questions you were posing? What sources were you consulting? How did this study help you to arrive at the idea of microhistory for which you became famous? And what is microhistory?
Well, I mean, first of all, I must say microhistory emerged from a debate within a group of Italian historians. I should mention Edoardo Grandi, Giovanni Levi, Carlo Poni. My book was published before the emergence of that debate. So in a sense, actually I never used the word microhistory in that book. So can be called retrospectively, can be regarded as an example of microhistory, and actually would not object. But the real debate about microhistory using that word or microanalysis, as Grandi did, this started some years later, and possibly also as a reflection, as a also polemical reflection on my own book, The Cheese and the Worms. I mean, I can say how the book emerged. I say that I had come across that document concerning a Benandante. Then the next destination of my archival journey was Udine, and because I knew that there were inquisitorial trials in the Ecclesiastical Archive of Udine, which is not far from Venice. So I took a train, I went there. I tried to enter the archive, impossible. The archive was not available to scholars. So I was in Udine, lovely city, lively, and I started to work at in the town library, Biblioteca Comunale, and by chance, a really lucky chance, I found a document, handwritten document, which had been stolen from the Ecclesiastical Archive and then bought back by the town library. It was a list of the first 1,000 trials, inquisitorial trials, performed in Friuli, and luckily, the description of those trials was longer than in Venice. So I started reading those trials. It was like reading the menu of an available and unavailable banquet, because the archive was closed. So I was I was reading those trials, the resume of those trials. There were a lot of trials against Benandanti. And then, so I was taking notes. Ultimately, I was able to enter the archive. But I was taking notes, and I came across a trial against a peasant who believed that the world had emerged from rotten matter. I was struck by the strangeness of this description, impressed by the anomaly. I must confess, I've been always fascinated by anomalies. Later on, I was thinking that I tried to argue on a general level that anomalies are more instructive from a cognitive point of view than norms, because norms cannot include all the possible violations of the norm. But anomalies necessarily must refer to the norm. I argued about this, probably I wrote something about this, but then a Brazilian historian, who is also a friend, who wrote a very detailed book, a long book on Italian microhistory, sent me a message saying, but are you aware that your argument has been anticipated by Carlo Schmitt, the author of Political Theology, a very influential jurist, philosopher of law, extreme Catholic, then committed Nazi. I was surprised because when I had argued that, I put forward that argument about norms and their exceptions, I had not read yet Schmitt's Political Theology. I read it again. Actually, this is not his argument. He said, he referred his argument and said in a footnote, this has been put forward by a Protestant theologian. He didn't name him, Kierkegaard. In any case, in some way, this argument came to me, and I put forward this tension between norms and exceptions, which actually inspired by my latest book, Non di Manco, Nevertheless. Actually, I started my introduction with identifying the crucial source of Carl Schmitt's alleged original argument about norms and exceptions. Schmitt did not quote his source, could have referred to a Catholic scientist and philosopher and theologian, Pascal. But in any case, I'm not going to anticipate my argument. This will be a too long digression.
Yes. Okay. I have 3 more questions before we open it.
Yes.
Right. One is to do with another title, The Enigma of Piero. What was the Enigma? Why did you choose to study Piero? Link mathematics with the painting? Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, unfortunately, the title of the English translation is not mine. I didn't like it. I mean, it's too,
Wait.
self-evident.
You have the publisher of the English edition.
I see. But in any case, it would have actually I was extremely happy about, let's say, the publication of the book by Verso. But my title in Italian was Indagini su Piero. Indagini, meaning inquiries, but I think that, let's say, the detective-like element is probably even stronger in Italian. It's a bit more unusual to say indagini in a scholarly context. In any case, Indagini su Piero. And then there is a subtitle, which was kept in the English translation, meaning I worked on Piero's baptism, a marvelous painting at the National Gallery in London, then his frescoes in Arezzo, and then the flagellation, marvelous painting as big as this in Urbino. I had a very selective approach to Piero's paintings. I focused only on patterns and iconography. I didn't say a word about the style, as I emphasized in my introduction, which is absurd in a sense, because I've been fascinated by Piero's works, as everybody looking at his works, by his style, his powerful style. But as in an experiment, in a scientific experiment, I made a selection. This is not a one-to-one relationship to reality, in this case, Piero's works. I made a selection. But there was a sort of friction, an interface, we could say today, between my own approach and an art historical approach, focusing also and maybe primarily on Piero's style. And this was chronology. Chronology is, like the chronology of Piero's works is very debated because we have some evidence, but little evidence about dates of his works. And so I suggested a different chronology, for instance, of the flagellation, which has been regarded as an early work by Piero, by possibly the greatest art historian of the 20th century, meaning Roberto Longhi. I argued that actually this was not an early work by Piero, but was related to his stay in Rome in 1458-59. In any case, the reactions of many art historians to my work was highly critical. I was very happy about that. But because, if everybody would have accepted my argument, probably my argument would have been innocuous and uninteresting. So, I'm interested in, I like debates, even if we had a conversation, not a debate, but with interesting divergences. So, in any case, this was, let's say, the topic of my book on Piero. Why did I write it? It emerged in a strange context. Visiting Syracuse in Sicily, visiting the museum there with a lot of works from antiquity, including a huge Greek vase. And I was circling the vase, and I saw it's a battle against the Amazons. And there is a soldier with a knife in his hand doing this. And I was looking at it, and I immediately thought about a detail in Piero's frescoes in Arezzo on the left side. In any case, I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't work on Piero. I was working on a completely different topic, meaning the witches' Sabbath. only much later, after having spent some years working on Piero della Francesca, actually writing a book on Piero, I realized that there was a deep, a profound connection between my project on the Witches' Sabbath and Piero della Francesca. My approach to Piero, meaning the relationship between morphology and history. Morphology, meaning a completely ahistorical approach in which time and space are put in parentheses. I'm fascinated by connoisseurship. By the way, I'm not a connoisseur at all. I'm not an art historian. But the way in which an art historian comes across a painting and says, this is by, or this was made in Cremona in 1550. On which basis? On, let's say, a stylistic basis, without knowing anything about, let's say, external evidence. This is morphology, a word which goes back to Goethe's work on plants, on animals, on animal bones. So, morphology and history. History was represented in the 16th and 17th century as a goddess with two eyes, chronology and geography. In the case of morphology, you don't have neither chronology nor geography very often. So you work on folds, In my work on the Witches' Sabbath, I tried to use morphology in order to rescue lost historical connections. So the final chapter is entitled